the recipe. And last week we took a look at this idea that God created us, that you individually, are God's favorite recipe. Now, I got a question in one of our small groups, and actually one of my kids asked when they got home, if I'm God's favorite recipe, then God has like millions of favorite recipes, because everybody is God's favorite recipe. And that's true. But the important thing is to realize, yes, you can have multiple favorite recipes. But the important thing is to realize is to take that very personally. You know, take it to the point where, yes, God took his time and created everyone. But really think about yourself. God took his time in putting together the recipe that is you. And he took his time forming you, and he took his time and he put specific personality traits inside of you for specific reasons so that you could glorify him. And last week we looked at, or I shared with you guys, my favorite turkey recipe, cider brined turkey that Kirsten and I have made more than once for Thanksgiving. We plan on making it again this year, I assume. I don't know. We haven't really talked about it. But that's my favorite turkey recipe. Now, I'm going to share with you another one of my favorite recipes. This may just be at the top of my recipe list, period. It's Kirsten's homemade pumpkin pie. Right? How many of you are pumpkin pie fans? Sweet. Yes. Awesome dessert. Now, I'm not going to lie. Like, pumpkin pie is good. Right? I love a good piece of pumpkin pie. You can go to a restaurant and get a good piece of pumpkin pie. And that's about here, right? But Kirsten makes this pumpkin pie, and it just takes it to a whole nother level. I mean, like, for instance, this crust, this is not just a store-bought crust, right? This is like a crust made from scratch. Like, she takes flour and stuff and puts it all together on the counter and rolls it out nice and flat to make this crust to lay out in the pan. And then the pumpkin filling that goes inside the pie isn't just the stuff out of a can from the store that you can get anywhere. No, this is like legit pumpkin that we grew at home, that we picked from the vine, that she cut in half and like baked upside down and then scooped all the stuff out of it and mashed it or blended it, or I don't remember what you did to scoop it all out. She's genius at that stuff though. And she put this all together with spices and stuff and made this pie. Now, it gets better than just the pumpkin pie though, because the Cool Whip is an important part of the pumpkin pie, right? How many of you are Cool Whip fans? Like, it's got to have some Cool Whip on it, right? So this Cool Whip though is not just Cool Whip from a can. It's not just Cool Whip from a tub. No, this Cool Whip is homemade. She takes heavy whipping cream, puts it into a blender, mixes it with some sugar, and whips it and whips it and whips it, whips it until it becomes this frothy, creamy, amazing goodness. But she doesn't stop there, right? Because earlier in the day, while she was making the pie, she made pecan crumbles. And then you layer the top with like this sugary pecan goodness, amazingness. Wow, it is an awesome recipe, right? And I know, I jumped from like the turkey to the pumpkin pie and I skipped over the sides, but I could not pass up this pumpkin pie recipe, because this recipe, man, it's just like you take a bite and you just have to stop and just let it sit for a little bit. Have you ever had one of those moments where you just have to stop and let it sit there so that you can enjoy all the flavor that is mingling and commingling in your mouth before you swallow it down and take another bite? It's awesome. It's awesome. So we've been looking at Thanksgiving, and we've been looking at the way that God creates us. But did you know that Thanksgiving is not just an American holiday? How many of you thought Thanksgiving was only American? Anybody? Nobody. few of you. It's okay to think that. I'll be honest. Before this week, when I was doing this sermon, I was pretty certain that Thanksgiving, like the holiday and stuff, was American. But Thanksgiving actually originated a long, long time ago. Thanksgiving is based off of this idea of Thanksgiving feasts. Thanksgiving feasts were feasts that were had because someone was grateful for God's provision in their life. And so whenever anybody had something to celebrate, and the culture wanted to celebrate in a big way, they would say, all right, everybody get together. We're having a Thanksgiving feast. We're going to give thanks that God has given us this provision. And so the very first Thanksgiving, the one that our holiday is based on, was a Thanksgiving feast that they had because of the first successful corn crop harvest. The next Thanksgiving was not until 2 years later when they celebrated the end of a drought that was threatening to demolish all of their crops. Actually, Thanksgiving feasts became pretty common in early America. And they were had fairly often because times were just hard and they had a lot of things to be thankful for. But even way, way, way before America, feasts of Thanksgiving were happening. You can go all the way back to the Old Testament, and you can look in the book of Leviticus, and there are specific instructions given to God's people if they wanted to offer a thank offering, or if they wanted to give a gift of thanksgiving to God. And these instructions, see if this sounds familiar, all right? So you had to make this food a certain way. It was a special type of food, and you would bring this food before God, and they would do what they call a wave offering. I don't know much about it, but from what I read, it sounds like you do this. It sounds like you're like, thanks God for this food, right? And then God had very specific instructions. You had to, whatever you brought before God, sometimes it was like a piece of bread made a specific way. Sometimes it was an animal. You had to sit down as a family and you had to eat all of that stuff that you brought to God as a Thanksgiving offering. You had to sit down and you had to eat it all that day. None of it was allowed to be left until the next day. Sounds a lot like a Thanksgiving meal, right? You just come together and you eat a whole lot. And so these Thanksgiving offerings happened throughout the course of the Bible. And there's one specific Thanksgiving offering that I want to focus on today. One specific Thanksgiving celebration, and that is the Passover. How many of you have heard of the Passover? Anybody? All right, most of you have heard of the Passover. The Passover can also be found in the Old Testament. It was to celebrate that God saved his people from slavery in Egypt. Right? And so every year, to celebrate that God saved his people from slavery in Egypt and he brought them out of Egypt safely, they would sit down and they would have a specific meal that was special that they had only that time of year. And they would eat specific foods in a specific order, and they would all sit together and celebrate and give thanks that God provided for them. Now, fast forward a few hundred years. I promise I'm going to connect all this. All right, I promise. Fast forward a few hundred years. Jesus is having Passover with his disciples. Jesus is having Passover with his disciples. They're gathering together to celebrate God's provision. And check out what happens during this meal of thanks. During the supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist, and then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, there is a whole lot that is happening in this very teeny tiny section of Scripture. There are a whole lot of different directions that we could go when we start to look at thankfulness and Thanksgiving and this idea of Passover. We could look at how Jesus gave his disciples an example of how they should love others. We could look at this idea that it wasn't Jesus' job to wash the disciples' feet. That was a servant's job, and Jesus was humbling himself, and he was showing how you should humble yourselves and love others. You could look at this idea that Jesus knew that Judas was sitting there and that Peter was sitting there and that all his disciples were going to scatter and flee and betray him, and he still washed their feet in just the amount of love. But I want to focus on something just a little bit different from all of those areas. Because here's what I think was happening in this moment. In this moment, Jesus knew what was coming. In this moment, Jesus had spent 3 years with these men hanging out. It was more than just training them to go out and spread the gospel to the rest of the world. It was more than just making disciples so that they would go out and make more disciples. No, Jesus loved these men. He had spent 3 years with them, day in and day out. They were close. They were tight. They were friends. And I think in that moment, Jesus just took a moment to step back and pause and just delight in his disciples. You know, this time of Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays because it's at Thanksgiving time where you can sit down together as a family and for just a moment, everything kind of slows down. And I wonder if everything kind of slowed down in this moment. As Jesus stood up and wrapped a towel around him, I wonder what was going through his head as he took the disciples' feet into his hands. You see, we read over this and we say, he tied his towel around his waist, and then he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet. And I tend to think, wow, that is absolutely disgusting, right? Like, guys, not many of you have seen my feet, except like maybe Kirsten or Shane, maybe on CIY, but they're disgusting, right? They're just hairy and gross, and like if they get sweaty, it's just like you don't even want to go there. And so Jesus is holding the men that walk in sandals everywhere they go, right? And so like I kind of read over that and I'm like, wow, that is big of Jesus to wash the feet. But I don't think Jesus had any of that on his mind. You know, and I don't think that probably Jesus was sitting there and he was just scrubbing, like, man, we got to get these feet clean because we got some dirty feet here. Let's clean these feet up, like scrub, 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 right? No, what I think happened in this moment is Jesus gently and lovingly got down and he took their feet into his hand. And I imagine that as he washed his feet, he wasn't looking at their feet, but he was looking up into their eyes. I don't know if you've ever had one of those moments where someone looks into your eyes and you can tell there's just delight there. Maybe you have. Oftentimes we seek delight in romantic relationships. We seek this idea of someone delighting in us through romantic relationships, and there's this deep need for us to be delighted. But the delight that God takes in his disciples here was far beyond anything that we can or will ever experience on this earth. It's something that we all seek. And I can picture Jesus staring into the disciples' eyes and them just feeling this overwhelming, incredible love, like they are just delighted in. And I wonder in that moment as Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, looking into their eyes, if he thought back to years earlier. If he thought back to a time way before the disciples were ever thought about on this earth, when he stood in heaven with God and he said, all right, God, we're going to make this Peter guy, right? So what do you think he should be like? You think he should, I think that he should just be this guy that is he's a go-getter. And you know that he's going to be the first one to speak up. He's going to be the first one to step out. He's going to be somebody that, man, he is loyal and he's going to go. And I wonder if he thought back to years earlier when he had planned these disciples' lives like we talked about last week. I wonder if he thought as he looked back into their eyes, if he thought of the moment where he knit these men together in their mother's womb, where he created the recipe that would become these men. And I wonder if the disciples saw in Jesus' eyes this idea that he just delighted in them. Delight is something we seek, and it's something we crave. Delight is something that we need in our life. And I'm here to tell you, maybe some of you have experienced delight to some extent, but I can guarantee it was lacking. I can tell you this. There is a God who absolutely delights in you. There is a God who stares into the soul of who you are, and everything pauses for a moment as he just takes you in. There is a God that looks at you and is just completely amazed by the person that you are. And I don't know if Jesus were in this room today, I don't know that he would go around and take off everybody's shoes and start washing your feet, because that's not something that we do in our culture today. But here's what I do think. I think that if Jesus was in this room today and he was sharing with us what you meant to him, he would look directly into your eyes and would say everything. He would look directly into your eyes and you would know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are delighted in. You know, when I eat this pumpkin pie, I'm a fast eater. You can ask Kirsten. We were just sitting down for, I don't know what we were eating the other day, but we were just sitting down for lunch and she looked over and she was like, "You're done with that already?" And yeah, I've always been just this crazy fast eater. But when this pumpkin pie comes out, seriously, it's like I take a bite and I just have to chew it slowly so that I can take everything in. And when God looks at you, everything pauses for a moment as he just takes you in. We don't feel that very often in this culture. And see, we look at ourselves in this culture and we look at ourselves based off everything that the world pushes at us, and we look at ourselves and we say, nope, I'm not delighted in, and I'm not worthy of delight, and I'm not worthy of love, and I don't measure up, and I can't be good enough, and I can't be the person that I'm supposed to be, and I'm not popular enough, and people don't really like me, and people don't really love me. And God is sitting up there saying, those are all just lies. The one that matters, the one that created everything, looks at you and thinks you're awesome. And he just takes delight in you. And I can picture God up in heaven. I can picture him up there elbowing the angels. And he's like, dude, dude, did you just see that? Did you just see what they did? Do you see how far they've come? Do you see who they are becoming? Do you see the difference and the impact that they're making? And he is pointing you out to everybody around him in heaven, taking delight in you. You guys, we don't believe that enough. We don't buy it enough. And I think that if we could experience the delight of a heavenly Father, it would radically change us. It would radically change us. Yes, the world is still going to feed us lies. It's still going to tell us we're not pretty enough, we're not good enough, we're not successful enough, we're not popular enough. It's going to feed us all those lies. But we can always come back to this truth that if Jesus were sitting in this room, he would look you in the eyes and you would know you're good enough. You would know you are exactly who God created you to be. And you know what that means? That means you're successful enough. It means you are God's masterpiece. And God sits there and he just delights in you. And I so wish and I so hope that you believe that. I give a practical challenge every single week. And the practical challenge this week is a little bit weird. It's a little bit odd. I'll admit that. But here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to do this at least 3 times. I want you to pray, God, show me how you delight in me. Sounds pretty easy, right? But that's not the only part of the challenge. I want you to pray, God, show me how you delight in me. And then I want you to go stand in front of a mirror and just stare into your own eyes for 1 minute. And picture that it is God staring into your eyes. And he's looking at you and everything is slowing down. And you know you are delighted in. Check out this video.
Value. You look up the word and you get something like this. Can you read it? No? It's too small. You zoom in, and the first definition says, the regard that something is held to, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. But that's not what I'm looking for. If you scroll down, you'll see this. Consider someone or something to be important. High value. Great value. Oh. Psalm 139:14 says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. He took the time to say, this is who you will be.